Hi again, Heather with Snap Happy Gal Photography. Last time we talked about interpreting the histogram, so today we're going to take a look at why we care about it and how to use it in photo editing. One of the most common uses for the histogram is to evaluate clipping, which happens when your image isn't exposed properly. If it's too underexposed, you're going to lose details in the dark tones, which will print muddily. And if it's too overexposed, you lose details in the highlights, and those will often print white or even a weird gray. Fortunately, if you're shooting in RAW, which I assume you are because you're here learning about the RAW editor Lightroom, you can often recover those seemingly lost details. Let's take a look at some real-life examples.
My workflow generally consists of doing global edits in Lightroom via the Basic tab in the Develop module, followed by selective and artistic edits in Photoshop. What I'm trying to achieve in Lightroom is a strong foundation, and that's an image with appropriate white balance, good contrast, and has noise removed. Since all the other edits depend on white balance, I start there. In landscapes, white balance comes down to personal choice, although some choices will look better than others. So you'll want to keep an eye out for overly blue snow, weird colors in clouds, or odd colors showing up on the tips of white caps, like in waves and things like that. In portraits, you need to make sure that neutrals are neutral so that you can get skin tone correct. And what you'll do there is use your white balance on clothing that should be gray or white to make sure that it is gray or white in your image. Next is the hard part, and that's achieving good contrast, or making sure that the tones in the image cover the full range of lights and darks. I actually like to let Lightroom take a stab at this first through the auto edit feature, and then I go from there, analyzing the light tones, and then the dark tones, and then making tweaks until the data kisses the edges of the histogram at both ends. Data climbing the walls at the ends indicates clipping, which we generally try to avoid. After the histogram looks good, I play around with the clarity and the colors, usually via the vibrance slider because saturation tweaks are intense and makes yellows go wonky. I do all of my sharpening in Photoshop, but if you're not a Photoshop user, you will also want to sharpen at the end of your edit through this tab as well. We're going to start with this image, which I called easy the other day because there isn't really any clipping at either end of the spectrum to speak of, so there aren't really any trouble spots. So first we're going to start with white balance, and to that end, I like to make sure the space around the photo is set at 50% gray. You can change yours by right-clicking in the area and selecting 50% gray. The reason for that is because it makes a really good basis of comparison for your brain so that you could know if you're happy with the white balance. Here we're looking at snow, so I'm going to press W to bring up the dropper tool and see if I like it when the snow is actually neutral. You can see by comparing to the edge here that the snow is actually pretty blue starting out. I'm just clicking a spot, and you'll notice all the colors and even the histogram changes when I select that white balance. I actually think I liked it better before, so I'm going to go back to As Shot and maybe just bump the warmth up a little and maybe play around with the arrow keys to see if I like reducing a little bit of the green. And I think I like that, so I'm just going to hit enter and be done with that. Pressing W returns the white balance dropper to its toolbox. I always like to see what Lightroom gives me for starters, so I'm going to press this auto button. And I still feel like the image is a little dark, but this time Lightroom didn't do too bad. So I'm just going to click this section of the histogram and drag it a little to the right to brighten it. And Lightroom is often very aggressive on the blacks, and I feel like it was here too, but I'm actually okay with it. And so now I'm going to add just a little punchiness by checking out the clarity. This is a personal choice. It does add some contrast. I think I like it about there. And then we'll play around with the colors a bit. If I add a little bit of vibrance versus removing it, I think I like it there. And I'll show you the same thing with saturation. Can desaturate. You'll notice that when the saturation starts climbing up, what's happening with the yellows there. So I'm just going to return that a little lower. The vibrance is kind of like a smart saturation control. So that's it for overall tones, and now I'm going to address the noise in the detail panel. I like to zoom in somewhere dark because that's where we're most likely to have introduced noise. And first, I'm going to reduce the graininess. And then I'm going to just remove this color noise, and you can watch it go away in this sky here. And I'm just going to show you before and after on the noise. And I'm going to hit backslash for a before and after on the edit. Okay, this one is arguably even easier because I'm already happy with the white balance. So we'll move straight into checking out what Lightroom does with it. And as you can see, Lightroom introduced more clipping in the highlights and introduced some clipping in the blacks. So first we're going to option click the whites and see if we can't bring that down some. And it is removing it, but it's being pretty recalcitrant there in the scarf. Maybe we can bring it down a little bit more there. Now the image is just a little dark, so I'm going to brighten the exposure a bit. And as you can see, I didn't get rid of the clipping entirely. I can drag it all the way down and it's just not really doing much. So I'm going to Command Z to undo that, and we're just going to live with that little bit of clipping. But now we're going to look at these black tones, and as you can see, Lightroom is a little aggressive at darkening things. I'm going to option click and see that Petey has some clipping around his eyes, and I would really rather that not be there. That mostly gets rid of the clipping, so we're going to keep it like that. And now we're going to come down and look at adding some punch by playing around with the clarity a little. And I'm actually pretty happy with the vibrance. It's important to keep in mind that when adding vibrance and saturation that you might also introduce some highlight clipping. So keep an eye on your histogram and adjust as necessary. And now that this part of the edit is done, I'm going to scroll down to the Detail tab. I'm going to zoom in on this dark section because that's where we're most likely to have introduced noise. And it doesn't look grainy or color noise, so we are just going to leave that, and this one is ready for Photoshop. A little dark to assess the white balance, so I'm going to jump right in and hit auto for Lightroom to do its thing. And this looks a little cold to me since it's definitely a golden hour shot, so I'm just going to warm it up over here. And then I'm going to bump the tint up a little because this looks just a bit green to me. I'd say that looks pretty good, so I'm going to commit that by pressing enter. And I'm just going to redo the auto on that because changing the white balance does change how all the data are interpreted. And as you can see, I've got a little bit of clipping in the blacks and the highlights. So I'm going to start by dragging down this white slider, and I'm just going to press the option key. That's very minimal clipping, so I'm okay leaving that. And now I'm going to drag this slider up until I get rid of that clipping. So the clipping's taken care of, but the image seems a little dark to me overall. So I'm just going to bump up the exposure, which reintroduced some clipping. So we're going to option click on one of the light tones. Okay, still not too bad, so we will just leave that as is. This section still looks pretty dark, so I'm going to see about removing just a little bit of contrast. And now we're ready to go on and add a little bit of clarity, which just adds like some edge contrast. And I'm going to play around with the vibrance slider here a bit. Okay, so let's before and after edit on this. All right, so now we're ready to assess the noise. I'm just going to click into a dark spot. So here at 100%, I'm just not seeing much, which is probably a result of this being shot at ISO 100. So this one is ready for Photoshop. Challenging. We've got some tones reaching all the way into the dark ends, but if you see here, we are clearly climbing the walls. And just to show you, I'm going to option click highlights. That white is really blown out, so we've got basically no detail there. Obviously, you wouldn't print that, it doesn't look good, but just to show you. So first thing first, this is a fall shot and it looks very greenish blue, so I'm going to warm it up here for the white balance. There, the trees are looking better. And maybe just a slight bump in the magenta tones. And now let's watch Lightroom do its magic. It looks like there's still quite a bit of highlight clipping, so let's just grab one of these sliders. Again, I could grab the exposure, the highlights, or the whites, but I'm going to option click the whites. It really doesn't look that bad. So just going to drag until those little clipping warnings disappear, and you can see that the histogram is just barely touching, so that clipping is cleaned up. And let's go ahead and look at these darkest tones. Looks like they're just barely clipping at the bottom in the tree trunks and over in those tree shadows. Not a big deal, but we'll go ahead and get that cleared up as well. This still reads as pretty bright to me, so we can play with the exposure. If we bring that down, it helps, but these wispy clouds are just, they're all the way white. Since we've darkened it, I'm gonna go ahead and just bring these shadows up. The whole image is a little bit muddy, so we will add a little bit of clarity, and it's also fairly unsaturated, so we'll just add a little bit of vibrance and play around with the saturation there. In all honesty, this probably isn't an image that I would go forth and edit, but just to show you the power of raw data, here's the after, and I'm going to hit the backslash to view the before. So definitely recovered a lot of detail in the sky, and just to finish the process off, we'll click into the detail tab and check out any noise. Our setup here, very bright sky that appears to be blown out with lots of dark tones. So just to show you another option for assessing the white balance, we could try out cloudy or even shade, since we were standing in shade. I feel like that looks pretty good, so we'll just stick with that. And now we will click auto and let Lightroom do its thing. As you can see, Lightroom has pulled out the clipping here, but the sky still looks like it's a mess and it's got some weird colors in it. Now just to jump back to what it looked like at the beginning, and I'm over in the history tab, which is off screen. If you had shot this on camera and had noticed the amount of clipping like I did, you could reshoot it for basically the same image, but the amount of clipping to start out is much lower. So let's switch back over to that shade preset and then hit auto. Not that this is an amazing image, but we've gotten rid of the clipping and there's a lot of detail remaining in the sky. So knowing about histograms could be really useful to take a quick look on your camera and know whether it's going to be easily recoverable or if it's going to be a disaster. So we'll go ahead and assess the highlight clipping. Tiny bit there. Bet we can remove it. Okay, so the highlight clipping is all the way cleared up. However, now I'm not quite touching the end, so I'm just going to drag this back to the right. And now we're just kissing the end over here. Lightroom brought the blacks down pretty dark, so I'm going to option click that and just bring those up until the histogram is just touching the end there. And last, we'll add a little bit of clarity, add some edge contrast here in the trees, and I'm going to add a little bit more vibrance and just to play around with the saturation. Trees get a little bit fluorescent there, so I'm going to back that off. If I took this into Photoshop, I would do more work on the sky and add some selective, I'd add some selective saturation there. And now we'll click into some shadowy areas. Because we brought down the exposure instead of bringing it up, it looks like we did not introduce a lot of noise, so this one is ready. All right, now we're gonna tackle a pretty dark one. I think because this is shot at blue hour, I'm just gonna leave the white balance where it is because I like this kind of purpley sand with the blue sky. If this was your photo, you could change it to whatever made you happy, but I'm just gonna stick with this. And so we'll jump right into auto. And you can see straight away that Lightroom actually did a pretty good job tackling this histogram. So I'm just gonna leave it as is because the brightness looks good to me and we have data across the whole entire spectrum. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of clarity, which will add some contrast around those leaves. And I'm gonna play around a little with the saturation. And now that I have it at this point, I feel like maybe I do want to change the white balance. I feel like I like the grass to be warmer. And if I were going to take this into Photoshop, I would selectively play around with this sky and work on it some. Since we did brighten this one up quite a bit and it was already shot at an ISO of 800, I bet we do have to do some noise reduction on this one, so we're just going to click in at 100%. And yeah, you can see quite a bit of grain here. So just going to start dragging that slider up until it's gone. And that definitely looks soft, but this is where I would take it into Photoshop and finish my edit and then sharpen. Okay, taking a look at another dark one before we move on to a couple of sunsets and an HDR series. Again, I'm not going to touch the white balance. Partly this is because I leave my camera in its daylight setting, and this is daylight, so it captures the color pretty well. So I'm going to jump straight into contrast. And Lightroom does a pretty good job here on auto. I feel like this is just a little dark still, so I am going to bring up the blacks and maybe just drag this a little bit to the right. I could have done that with a slider down below, but I happened to notice this big hump of data here and I wanted to shift it to the right a little. Probably going to do the same thing with exposure because I still feel like the photo is just a little dark. And at this point, it looks like I've introduced just a tiny bit of highlight clipping, so I'm going to option click and just drag that slider down until it goes away. Now we're ready to add a little bit of clarity for some edge contrast. And now that I'm looking at it, these trees look just a little bit blue, so I am going to bump up the warmth just a bit, and then I wait and just see to make sure that there are no real changes in my histogram. And now I will scroll down so that I can check for any issues with noise. You'll notice here I chose the water to zoom into instead of the dark trees. Since the water is relatively smooth, it's easier to see any noise. I can't quite tell if there's noise there or not, so I'm going to do just a little bit of noise reduction to be safe. But otherwise, this one is ready for Photoshop. Sunsets are challenging to expose for because you often majorly blow out the highlights or clip the shadows. And as you can see looking at that histogram, we have clipping in both regions. But if you shot in RAW, like I did, even on this D5100, you can bring back a lot of details. So first we'll do the white balance like usual. Gonna try the shade preset. And it is way too warm. Cloudy still feels too warm. I kind of like the tones I'm getting with Lightroom's daylight preset, so I'm going to leave it there. You could play around with these numbers until you got something you were happy with. And now I will jump into the contrast edits, and let's just see what Lightroom gives us. Okay, it did brighten it some, but it did make clipping worse in both cases. So let's jump right in and see how bad the highlight clipping is by option clicking the white slider. Okay, so there's definitely some clipping, but watch when I drag it to the right. Particularly bad clipping starts to show up as yellow and white. So we're just going to reduce that clipping and be okay with it. Probably not going to recover it all the way. And we will go ahead now and tackle the dark tones. Option click that black slider. Okay, so the clipping there is taken care of, but it's still pretty dark. So I'm just gonna grab this part where this big chunk of data lives and start to drag it to the right to lighten it up. And I'm gonna grab here in the middle and drag that to the right as well. Now the image looks pretty bright, but I have introduced more clipping. So let's just go back down and grab one of these sliders and assess. Okay, so it looks pretty bad on the histogram, but not too bad in real life. Totally printable. So now we will come down and add some clarity to bring some edge detail in those trees. We could play around with the vibrant slider, but this sunset, watch what happens to the histogram. It starts to push more of those colors in, so we'll just leave that right where it is. And last, we will check the detail in the shadows. Okay, this one's pretty grainy, which is not a surprise because we had to bump up the exposure quite a bit in post, and that's always where you'll see noise. So we're gonna drag this luminance slider quite a bit to the right to get rid of the grain. I'm gonna drag it around and see. I don't really see any color noise. Some cameras produce it more than others, and definitely the longer you have your shutter open, the worse it gets too. So don't be surprised if you don't see color noise until you're shooting night shots. But this one is ready to tackle in Photoshop, or if you wanted to do more artistic edits in Lightroom, you would be ready for that. Very similar to the previous one, although it was shot on a different camera. This one's shot on a Nikon Z7, and you'll notice straight away that the numbers for the white balance are different. That's just what this camera chooses for its daylight white balance. So again, I'm gonna run through and see if I like the shade better. Ooh, that's a lot. That's very, very pink and a little bit too warm. Okay, so with this camera, the way it's set up, that's just way too much magenta. So I'm gonna drop that back. I'm just gonna edit it there. Again, it can be personal preference. So just like the previous one, there's clipping in both the highlights and the shadows, but potentially because it is a much newer camera, there's less clipping in both. So we're gonna do the Lightroom auto tone, and this blue smidge over here tells me we do have quite a bit of clipping, but we will assess that in a minute, and we still have some clipping here. So let's option click the whites, which I'm just choosing because Lightroom bumped it up and there's clipping, so it's easy to drag it back down. So as you can see, this gets rid of most of the clipping, and it's no surprise that the very center of that sun has clipped. Totally not a big deal. And now let's assess where the clipping is in the dark tones. Right over there in those trees. Honestly, there isn't much detail there. They're like a silhouette. A silhouette's one of those times where you don't want any details, so it's fine just to leave that. So now we'll just assess the overall brightness, which is not very, and I would like it to be brighter. So I'm just gonna drag this section of data and brighten that up a bit. The more aggressive you are on it, the more it introduces noise. So I had it drug up, but it was all the way up, and that makes me a little uncomfortable for dealing with the noise later. So we will instead try bringing up the exposure. So now I have the brightness where I want it. It did introduce more highlight clipping, so let's just go back and reassess that. All right, so that seems like a little bit much. We'll just get rid of some of that highlight clipping. And now we're ready to play around with the clarity and the colors. Because I like the texture of the ice so much, I'm going to add quite a bit of clarity. And the vibrance is already bumped up, but let's just play around with it. I feel like that's a little bit much, but it's kind of fun. So this one would be ready to move on and assess our noise. And I'm just going to click over here because this looks pretty smooth, so we will definitely be able to see the noise. We were pretty aggressive in our shadow edits, so I'm going to drag that slider and see what we get. Okay, so the grain is taken care of, and this camera does seem to be pretty bad about introducing color noise. So I'm going to drag that slider and now notice how smooth those trees are. They will of course need to be sharpened in Photoshop later, but this image is now ready to take over and finish the edit. Okay, here we are at Kitchity Kippy, Michigan's Big Spring in the UP. And I shot this image as a bracketed set to show you how to shoot in HDR in case you find yourself in really challenging light. An HDR is when you have a high dynamic range and you want to make sure you cover everything. So you shoot at least 3 frames, usually 3 will suffice, where you shoot an overexposed frame to capture all of the darks because you know you're blowing the highlights, but you get the darks. You shoot an underexposed frame for the exact opposite reason. It's really dark, but you preserve all the detail in the sky or the highlights. And then you shoot a middle frame as kind of a reference, and then you have software compile them all. Lightroom can do it. I can teach you in a future video, but I already did it here. So this is the result of the HDR combination. And to my surprise, if we just take the middle frame and auto-tone it, you can see how similar the before and after are. You're getting a slight shift because I actually handheld this for the HDR shot, which I don't necessarily recommend, but the whole point is that if you shoot in RAW and you correct for highlights and darks and you make sure you don't have clipping, you might actually have a full tonal range and not need to do the HDR. So play around with editing and make sure you get those foundational skills, and you might not have to shoot as many frames as you think.
Hopefully this gives you a good idea of how to prepare an image with a strong foundation to build your artistic edits upon. Thanks for watching, and please let me know what else you'd like to learn. See you next time.